off with this CC Designs Victorian Emma image, and I stamped her onto CC Designs quality 110-pound cardstock with Memento ink, and then trimmed her out before I started filming. And started with the skin. This time I'm doing a little bit different color combo than I usually use. So I started with E50, and then I went in with E02, and then E11 for my darker areas, and then I added just a little bit of E13 just along the edges. And since the E13 and E11 are so close, they kind of blended themselves. So then I just went back in with the E02 to kind of blend them out a bit. And then finally went back in with my E50 to really blend it all together. And since the E50 is quite a bit lighter than those other ones, you kind of have to move quickly while it's still wet to make it blend easier. And then once it was blended, I went in with my R20, and since all the ink was still wet, the R20 just kind of blended itself. So skin was done, and then for her hair, I just went in with E44, just turning the image so that it faces me as I flick the color in to make it look more like strands of hair. And then I went in with the E47, and then finally E49 is my darkest. So once I had the E49, that's when I start going back and like making longer strokes so that it gives it a bit more dimension. And then I took the E47 again and did the same thing. And then once I've got that, I go back in with my E44 just to blend it a little bit more. And then finally, just to finish it off, I took the E49 and really lightly added a few more strands, and that was it for the hair. And then for her dress, I'm doing R24, then R27, and R29. And I'm not worrying about going outside the lines because I'm planning on covering all that up, so I'm not being particularly careful or neat with it because it's not going to matter. So once I've got the colors laid down, I go back in with my R24 and blend everything together. And then the kind of outer part of her dress, I had stamped onto a piece of pattern paper and then trimmed out. And then I'm just using my Tombow Mono Multi to adhere it to the image. So it takes just a little bit of fiddling because there's a couple of thinner parts there. So make sure I got it just over the lines and in place, so that covers up all the parts where I went over the lines. And of course, you can't leave the dress just as is. You got to add a bit of shading and whatnot so that it kind of goes with the rest of the image. So I went in with my W3 and added a bit of darker areas. And then I just took my W1 marker and blended that out a little bit. Not really worrying too much about it because it just kind of blends. And as the colors dry, it just looks right. So did that. And then I took my G99, which is a really, really dark green. It has to be dark to cover up some of the patterns of the paper, and I just did the trim of her dress and then the little leaves of the holly design on it, and then I just took the R29 marker to color in the little berries, and that was it for her dress. So normally I don't color around the edges, I always leave them white, but I decided to take my W3, one that kind of cleaned up the little bit of red there that went outside the lines, and I liked the look of it this time, so colored all that. And then for her little hand warmer, I have this really old tube of liquid applique. Had it for years and years. So mine is old, so it's kind of slightly discolored and really thick, but still works. So I squeezed that out onto her little hand warmer and swirled it into place. And you have many ways you can dry this. You can leave it overnight to dry. You can use a hair dryer to dry it, or you can use your heat tool. But before I dried it, I decided to add a little bit of glitter to it, just to make it glittery and pretty. And then yeah, I just used my embossing heat tool to heat it up and dry it. So you just have to be really careful with this because if you use your heat tool, because it gets so hot, you can actually burn it. So you just have to watch it, but then it makes it all puffy and dimensional looking. So once that was done, I'm using the Authentique Festive pattern papers for this card. So I used one of my Spellbinders oval dies to cut the largest oval and then matted it with a black scalloped oval. And then the little main image, I just used my dimensionals, applied a bunch of those so that she's popped up a little bit, and then just adhered her to the oval. And then the card front itself is just more of the festive pattern papers. So I just cut a small strip to kind of break up the red and white striped paper. And then I grabbed ribbon. This is my AmyR's seam binding ribbon. So wrapped that around the card front, tied it in a bow. Once I've got that tied, just trimmed it off a little bit so that the ends aren't too long. So once I've got that, kind of looking again at how I've got my layout going, and then I need to do a sentiment. So I just grabbed a scrap of red cardstock and lined up my sentiment onto the acrylic block, and that was just an embossing buddy I use that keeps the embossing powder from sticking to anything but the stamped part. So I inked up the stamp with my Stampin' Up! White craft ink, stamped onto the cardstock, and then I'm just using Detail White embossing powder. Got that flicked off, and then just heating that again with my heat tool. So once it's all melted, let it cool for a second, and then just trimmed it to how I wanted it. And then I'm going to adhere the main image to the card, just like so. And then I'm going to adhere the sentiment along the bottom, and I decided not to add any other embellishments. I think there's just enough going on with all the pattern papers and the main image and everything. And then as always, just regular Scotch tape on the back of the ribbon so that the adhesive just glides right over that. And then I'm going to mat that with a piece of black cardstock just to give it a little bit of a frame. And then I'm going to adhere that to the card base, which is again the same red cardstock as I used for the sentiment. So I'm going to get that done, and then I'm going to go on to the inside of the card. I decided to follow the exact same layout as I used on the outside, so just switching around the pattern papers, that way I could use up the pieces that I had already cut into. So got those cut, and then I just cut an oval from one of the more cream colored papers so there's a spot to write to the recipient. Then I grabbed another scrap of red cardstock and the companion sentiment. These are from my Christmas card words set, by the way. So lined that up on the acrylic block, stamped that onto the red cardstock, and then again embossed it with the white embossing powder. So, and I always use coffee filters because then that way I can just funnel them right back into the container. It's easy. So got that embossed, let it cool off, trimmed it down, and then just adhered all the pieces to the inside, and then I'm going to adhere that to the inside of the card, and that was it. So as always, there will be a link directly below to my blog post with links to all the supplies used. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!